We got along great. We did a lot of laughter.
For decades, it was one of Hollywood's most passionate and best-kept secrets. He was the king of rock and roll, and she was the fiery starlet who seemed to be his perfect match. Theirs was an explosive love affair, but it was a romance that was ultimately doomed from the start. While Ann-Margret broke her famous silence years ago in her memoir. Looking back now at the age of 84 gives her story a new poignancy. So, what really happened between Elvis Presley and the woman many still believe was his true kindred spirit? In the sun-drenched world of early 1960s Hollywood, legends weren't just born on screen, they were forged in the passion and scandal that simmered just beneath the surface. It was an era of larger-than-life personalities, and at the center of it all were two stars on a collision course. First, you had Elvis Presley. He wasn't just a singer, he was a cultural phenomenon. By 1963, he was a global icon whose every move was watched. He'd conquered music and was now a bona fide movie star. But behind the swagger, he was a man grappling with the immense pressures of his own myth, feeling the gilded cage of his fame closing in. Then there was Ann-Margret Olsen, a Swedish-born dynamo. She had exploded onto the Hollywood scene with a vibrancy that was impossible to ignore. After her breakout role in Bye Bye Birdie, she was hailed as the female Elvis, a nod to her electrifying energy. She was a triple threat, a phenomenal singer, a dazzling dancer, and a captivating actress. With her fiery red hair and unforgettable smile, she was a true force of nature. When these two were cast together in the 1964 film Viva Las Vegas, the studio just hoped for a hit movie. What they got was a collision of two souls that ignited one of the most legendary and heartbreaking love affairs in Hollywood history. For years, the full story was protected by Ann-Margret's dignified silence. But the truth she eventually shared reveals the beautiful, complicated, and ultimately tragic reality of her time with the king. The story begins where so many great Hollywood tales do. On a soundstage, it was July 1963, and MGM was gearing up for its new musical, Viva Las Vegas. Elvis, the film's star, was about to meet his new leading lady. Ann-Margret, just 22 years old, walked onto the nearly empty stage, her heart pounding. In her autobiography, she recalled the moment with perfect clarity. The room was huge, with only a piano in it. In the background, a few members of Elvis's entourage, the Memphis Mafia, watched quietly. A studio photographer was there to capture what everyone suspected would be a historic moment. The film's director, George Sidney, made the introduction. Elvis Presley, I'd like you to meet a wonderful young lady, Ann-Margret. She extended a tentative hand. Elvis, looking a little nervous himself, smiled, took her hand, and said, I've heard a lot of good things about you. With that one handshake, the air in the room changed. It wasn't just professional courtesy, it was a spark, an instantaneous connection that was obvious to everyone there. Ann-Margret described it as an almost surreal experience, saying, we experienced music in the same visceral way. Music ignited a fiery pent-up passion inside Elvis and inside me. This wasn't something they realized in hindsight. It was there. From day one, she later reflected, we looked at each other, move, and saw virtual mirror images. When Elvis thrust his pelvis, mine slammed forward, too. When his shoulder dropped, I was down there with him. This wasn't choreographed. It was pure instinct. It was like they were two halves of the same whole. The press conference that followed only amplified their chemistry. Cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, but Elvis and Ann-Margret seemed to be in their own little world, laughing at the same jokes and catching each other's eye across the room. The publicity team didn't have to invent a romance. One was unfolding right in front of them. Even Elvis's inner circle, men who had seen countless women come and go, knew this was different. One of his closest friends later said that Elvis was actually intimidated by her. Ann-Margret wasn't just another pretty co-star, she was his equal. She matched his energy, his talent, and his charisma in a way no one else ever had. The set of Viva Las Vegas became the backdrop for their love story. The script called for them to play lovers, but the lines between acting and reality blurred almost instantly. Their on-screen chemistry was so powerful because it was real. The playful flirting, the smoldering glances, the iconic dance numbers, it was all an extension of how they felt. Off camera, Ann-Margret wrote that from the moment they met, it felt like an inevitability, saying, we both felt a current, an electricity that went straight through us. It would become a force we couldn't control. That first meeting, on the quiet MGM soundstage, was the striking of a match. And in the high glamour world of Hollywood, that spark was about to ignite a fire that would burn brighter and more intensely than anyone could have imagined. That the electricity between Elvis and Ann-Margret wasn't just for the cameras. As filming continued, their on-screen romance quickly bled into a passionate, all-consuming affair. This was no casual fling or studio-manufactured publicity stunt. It was a deep, genuine connection between two people who were discovering they were, in her words, kindred spirits. In her memoir, Ann-Margret would later be clear about it. Our relationship was very strong, very serious, and very real. We were in love for a year. It started with innocent dates, with Elvis inviting her to a show in Las Vegas, his usual entourage in tow. Ann-Margret, used to being chaperoned by her parents, charmed the Memphis Mafia. They respected her, and they even gave her a nickname from her character in the film, Rusty. But soon, the group hangouts weren't enough. They needed to be alone. Ann-Margret knew she had entered new territory when Elvis started asking to see her without the guys. In those stolen moments, their bond deepened. They found out, they shared more than just a love for performing. They both loved motorcycles and the thrill of speed, often taking off for exhilarating rides together. They also shared the same sense of humor, a deep love for their families, and a quiet understanding of the crushing pressure of fame. Their time together became a whirlwind of secrets and inside jokes. They had pet names for each other to shield their intimacy from the outside world. He was her Scooby, she was his Thumper. To escape the glare of Hollywood, they'd take long drives into the hills above Los Angeles. It was there, under the stars, that Elvis truly opened up, and felt she got to know his heart, seeing past the king's public persona to the vulnerable man underneath. Like everyone else, she wrote, Elvis had dreams and desires, hopes and hurts, ... He didn't reveal this vulnerable side until everyone had disappeared. Elvis, a man who was deeply suspicious of people's motives, felt he could trust her completely. He confided his fears, his insecurities, and the profound loneliness that came with being the most famous man on the planet. Ann-Margret just got it. She saw the void in his heart, created by the knowledge that almost everyone wanted something from him. Their affair was an open secret in their circle. The passion was undeniable. At one point, Elvis had a large, round pink bed installed in his home, a piece of furniture clearly meant for her. They created a world of their own, one that felt perfect and untouchable. But a shadow loomed over their romance, a complication that couldn't be ignored. That shadow had a name, Priscilla Beaulieu. While Elvis was falling in love with his vibrant co-star in California, a young woman was waiting for him back at his home, Graceland, holding on to a promise he had made years before. The existence of Priscilla was the heartbreaking reality check, a ticking clock that signaled this beautiful romance was living on borrowed time. While Elvis and Ann-Margret were caught up in their Hollywood love affair, a quiet drama was playing out at Graceland. At the center of it was Priscilla Beaulieu, the young woman whose life was completely tied to the king's. To understand why his romance with Ann-Margret was doomed, you have to understand the story of Elvis and Priscilla. Elvis met Priscilla in Germany in 1959 while he was in the U.S. Army. 14. Despite the age gap, Elvis was captivated. After he returned to the U.S., he convinced her parents to let her move to Memphis and eventually live at Graceland. The deal came with a solemn promise to her father. Elvis would take care of her, make sure she finished school, and that his intentions were honorable. The unspoken promise was marriage. Priscilla's life at Graceland was strange and lonely. She lived in the home of the world's biggest star, but she was shielded from his Hollywood life. While she waited for him in Memphis, he was on the West Coast, making movies and, often, having affairs with his leading ladies. But the rumors about Elvis and Ann-Margret felt different. They were louder and more persistent. The press called her the female Elvis, and their chemistry in Viva Las Vegas was too real to be just acting. For Priscilla, every headline was agony. In her memoir, Elvis and Me, she described how she had a gut feeling this time would be different. Her fears were right. News of their affair reached her, not just through tabloids, but from people traveling between Elvis's two worlds. The stories of their matching motorcycles and secret dates drove Priscilla to despair. When she confronted Elvis on the phone, he tried to downplay it all as publicity for the movie, but the evidence was overwhelming. The situation became so tense that, according to some stories, a frustrated Priscilla even threw a vase against a wall in a moment of heartbreak. The affair was putting immense pressure on Elvis from all sides. This created an impossible love triangle. On one hand, Elvis was deeply in love with Ann-Margret. She understood him as an artist and as a person, and she was his equal. Many would say she was his soulmate. On the other hand, he was bound by his promise to Priscilla. In Elvis's world, a man's word was his bond, and he had given his to her father. On top of that, his controlling manager, Colonel Tom Parker, saw Priscilla as the safe choice for Elvis's image. Ann-Margret, with her own skyrocketing career and fiery independence, was a variable the Colonel couldn't control. Elvis was torn between his heart and his duty. He was in love with the woman who matched his fire, but committed to the woman he had promised to marry. This was the tragic flaw in their love story, the one obstacle that made a future together seem impossible. The intense affair between Elvis and Ann-Margret burned as brightly as a supernova, but it was destined to collapse under its own weight. Their romance was, as Ann-Margret came to understand, ultimately doomed. The biggest barrier was, of course, Elvis's commitment to Priscilla. He had given his word of honor to her parents that he would marry her. For Elvis, who held traditional views on honor, breaking that promise was unthinkable. Some sources even suggest her family was prepared to cause a major scandal if he backed out, something that would have been a disaster for his career. He was trapped by a promise made years before he met Ann-Margret. In her autobiography, Ann-Margret wrote about the situation with incredible understanding. There were other factors in Elvis's life that forced him apart from me, and I understood them, she explained. Elvis had always been honest with me, but still it was a confusing situation. She knew about Priscilla, and while it was painful, she acknowledged the reality. We knew the relationship had to end, that Elvis had to fulfill his commitment. But it wasn't just Priscilla. There was a more fundamental problem: their careers and their views on relationships. Despite his rebellious persona, Elvis was traditional. He expected his partner to be a homemaker, someone whose life revolved around his dot. Ann-Margret was never going to be that woman. She was a star in her own right, with a fierce ambition and a career that was just getting started. She wasn't about to give that up, not even for the king. Elvis's close friend, Red West, later wrote that while Elvis loved Ann-Margret, he also knew that deep down he knew she wouldn't ever take a backseat to his career, and rightfully so. A life with Elvis would have meant the end of her life as a performer, a sacrifice she just wasn't willing to make. The breaking point came in late 1964. Ann-Margret was in London when a reporter asked her about Elvis. Her comments were innocent, but British papers ran wild with them, printing sensational headlines that an engagement was imminent. The news got back to the U.S., reaching both Elvis and a devastated Priscilla. Elvis was reportedly furious, accusing Ann-Margret of leaking the story, a charge she has always denied. The incident brought everything to a head. The pressure from Colonel Parker and the fallout with Priscilla became too much. The beautiful bubble they had built for themselves finally burst. Their breakup wasn't one big, tear-filled fight. It was a slow, painful drift. The phone calls became less frequent until it was clear that Elvis had made his choice. He chose duty over passion. It was a heartbreaking end to a romance that had felt so right, proving that their love, however, real, couldn't survive the weight of his past and their conflicting futures. The end of the affair marked a painful turning point. Elvis and Ann-Margret went their separate ways. On May 1, 1967, Elvis married Priscilla Beaulieu in Las Vegas. In a strange twist of fate, just 1 week later, on May 8, 1967, Ann-Margret married actor Roger Smith in the very same city. It looked like the final chapter had been written, but some connections don't just disappear. While the romance was over, the deep friendship they had built endured. They had found a kindred spirit in each other, and that understanding outlasted the heartbreak. Just a couple of months after her own wedding, Ann-Margret opened her first live show in Las Vegas. On her opening night, a special guest was in the audience, Elvis Presley. He came to see her perform and celebrated with her backstage. It was a gesture of friendship that would set the tone for the rest of his life, and so began a tradition. For years, every time Ann-Margret opened a show in Vegas, a guitar-shaped floral arrangement from Elvis would arrive. It was his quiet, consistent way of saying, "I remember, I support you." There was often no card, but she always knew who it was from. Their friendship was built on absolute trust and privacy. They rarely spoke of each other in public, protecting the memory of what they shared. Ann-Margret found a stable, loving marriage with Roger Smith that would last 50 years. Until his death in 2017. He was her rock, managing her career and supporting her through incredible highs and lows. Elvis's life took a more tragic turn. His marriage to Priscilla ended in 1973, and he struggled deeply with fame and addiction. Through it all, his quiet friendship with Ann-Margret was a constant. The final heartbreaking chapter of their story came on August 16, 1977. Ann-Margret was in Vegas, getting ready to open another show. The day before, she noticed something was wrong. For the first time in a decade, the guitar-shaped bouquet from Elvis didn't arrive. A terrible feeling washed over her. She knew in her heart something was wrong. Elvis never missed their tradition. She called Graceland to check on him, only to have her worst fears confirmed just before the news broke to the world. The king was dead. She was devastated. Despite some advising her to stay away for the sake of her image, Ann-Margret and her husband flew to Memphis for the funeral. She was one of the only Hollywood figures to attend, a quiet, dignified presence among his family and friends. It was a final act of love and respect for the man she had once loved so deeply. The affair hadn't been the end of their story, but his death was. For decades after Elvis's death, Ann-Margret was a fortress of silence. In an industry that feeds on gossip, she chose dignity. While others wrote tell-all books, she refused to exploit her relationship with him. It wasn't until her 1994 autobiography, Ann-Margret, My Story, that she finally opened up, on her own terms. And even then, it wasn't a salacious tell-all. It was a tender, respectful reflection on a pivotal time in her life. She wrote with emotional honesty, focusing on the profound connection they shared. She painted a picture of two young people who found in each other a rare understanding, a kindred spirit. Looking back from the perspective of her 80s, her reflections carry even more weight. In the rare moments she speaks of Elvis today, you can see the deep affection remains. She confirms what everyone always suspected: their love was real and intense. It's why so many have called them soulmates, even if she herself sticks to simpler, more personal terms. She doesn't speak of scandal, but of connection. She remembers Elvis as kind and funny, with a soul full of both music and pain. She acknowledges the heartbreak of their doomed romance without any bitterness. She understood the forces at play: the promises, the pressure, the public image that made their love impossible. Her story has always been consistent. They shared a once-in-a bond that had to transform from a romance into a lifelong friendship. She doesn't dwell on the what-ifs, but the question hangs in the air. What if Elvis had been free from his promise? What if their careers hadn't been on a collision course? We'll never have the answers. What is clear is the enduring nature of their affection. By sharing her memories, Ann-Margret gave the world a gift, a more human portrait of Elvis Presley. She revealed a man who was vulnerable, who craved true connection, and who found, for one brief, shining year, a perfect mirror for his own soul. If you've been touched by this story of a love that transcended time, hit that like button and subscribe. For more untold Hollywood secrets, let us know in the comments what you think about this iconic romance. The love story of Elvis Presley and Ann-Margret is one of Hollywood's great tragedies, a tale of two kindred spirits who found each other, but just couldn't hold on. Born on the set of Viva Las Vegas, their connection was so electric it leaped right off the screen. For one magical year, they were everything to each other. It was a genuine love, a fiery passion that might have changed both their lives. But it was doomed from the start. Caught between the weight of past promises and the clash of two brilliant careers, Elvis was bound by his word, and Ann-Margret was a star who refused to have her light dimmed. They made the heartbreaking choice to let go, marrying other people just 1 week apart. Yet, that wasn't the end. Their affection transformed into a quiet friendship that lasted until his final days, symbolized by the guitar-shaped flowers he sent for every opening night. That last missing bouquet was a heartbreaking premonition that the music had finally stopped. Today, at 84, Ann-Margret's memories aren't filled with regret, but with a gentle, loving nostalgia. Her decades of dignified silence, followed by her graceful reflections, only underscore how profound their connection was. The story of Elvis and Ann-Margret is a reminder that the greatest loves aren't always the ones that last a lifetime, but the ones that leave an indelible mark on your soul.